Good day, people of Royal Oaks. It's a nice turnout. I don't know if there's anybody able to watch it upstairs or not, but it's a nice turnout, Paul.
Very good.
Well, today's program points up the fact that we have many individuals here in Royal Oaks that have experiences and information that pertains to us either in the past or in the future. So, fracking and horizontal drilling is the title of the program. And I know all of you have heard the term, and some of you may even know what that entails. But it includes locating and extracting non-renewable fossil fuels, and that has political, economical, and environmental concerns and ramifications. So it's very pertinent to us today. Our presenter is someone I only met this morning, or right now, actually. I know some of you have, but I didn't. So there are a lot of people like him around here I don't know. So, Paul Hoovler. Now, that's with an L. Make sure you know that. He's not Herbert Hoover or anybody like that.
No vacuum cleaners.
No, nor vacuum cleaner. He graduated in geology from OSU in 1951.
Yeah.
Okay. He has had considerable experience in education, which I'm not able to read on his card. So
I wonder why.
but he was in Kazakhstan in 1973.
93.
93, sorry. I asked you that once before. And he will tell you the rest. He retired in 2001, and you've been in Royal Oaks about 3 years, right?
Correct.
All right. Would you welcome Paul Hoovler?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I'm so happy to see you all. I hope what we, and I'm going to say we because it's hard to say I all the time. So whatever I present or we present is about current oil business, and then the video is about a well drilled 47 years ago up in Wyoming. It's the well that blew out, and we had a little problem with it. So I will begin by giving you a little tiny little course in geology, very little, a 401 or 101, whatever you want to call that, so that you're familiar with a couple terms. First thing that comes to mind is the kind of rocks you deal with in this business. And there's three major segments. There's igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. And the thing that primarily holds the oil of the world is the sedimentary sections. The igneous rocks are what you kind of think about a volcano or middle of the earth or whatever you want to call it. Metamorphic or sedimentary rocks that have been compressed and heated and changed into a different makeup. And a good example would be a shale that ends up as a slate, or a limestone that ends up as marble. That would be a metamorphic change. In our case, the sedimentary section is what's of importance, not only in Wyoming where I work mostly, but all over the world, the sedimentary section is comparable. Even if you're in Saudi Arabia or if you're in the United States, you can compare zones or formations because of their makeup. Sediments are basically formed by wind and rain and percolation of chemicals out of the ocean. And the oil is formed primarily from plants and fish, animal life. So if you want to think about it, you may be driving a shark today. I don't know. And we are talking a considerable length of time when we talk about the oil business. It's hard to wrap around, but the earth is over 4 billion years old. And the sediments that we discuss are over 200 million years old, some of them a little bit older. The rocks that are primarily produced today, the sediments are a bit younger. There is still some of the old production, but most of it's a younger age. For instance, maybe from the Pennsylvanian, that's a formation. From the Pennsylvanian to current, or from something a little older. My particular case, I'm speaking from a set of sediments that are around 7,000 feet. I'll introduce you to how you drill a horizontal well and then frack it on that basis. This is up in Colorado, northeast of Denver. There's a place called Wattenberg Field that several years ago had a lot of wells but didn't have much production. Most of them they all were vertical. They were all vertical completions. They all were tight being low porosity and permeability. Those are two terms that are very important to everybody in the industry. And I'll explain that. Porosity is nothing more than the void space between grains in a formation. And I might clarify the fact that oil does not sit down below us in lakes. It's in formations, it's in rocks. Most of it was formed in situ or in place. Permeability is the ability of a fluid to move through a formation or move through a matrix. The lower the permeability, the tighter and the more difficult it is to produce anything, and especially oil and gas, which is what we all look for. So permeability and porosity is most important. And on the rocks that we are drilling today, and this is nationwide, are formations that have been drilled through and perforated and fracked for years and years and years, everything horizontal. And the zones that you're able to open, or the length of a formation, is so minor compared to what you need that most of the production was at minimal, low profit. Some of the wells had an exception, of course, but most of the wells were minor, and they were now most of them stripper, which is under 15 barrels a day. About 20 years ago, we were at a point where our production was down below 6 million barrels a day. Our usage, all hydrocarbons, was almost 20 million. So there's a big gap in there that we couldn't fill because we didn't have any oil. We had run out of most of the shallow stuff in the country, and most of the stuff we knew about you couldn't produce because it was too tight. No porosity, no permeability. The permeability in a lot of these rocks are almost like concrete. And if you want to put water through that, it'd be difficult. So we were at a kind of a hole, and the industry knew it, and they started experimenting with, initially with horizontal drilling, and that was the big item. Because if you drill a well vertically, and you drill through the zone, if it's a 15-foot pay zone, that's what it is. If it's 25 feet, that's what it is. On a horizontal well, when you get to the zone, and if you mentally think about a pancake, you drill down to this pancake and you know it's the pay zone. And for our use, I'll say it's 50 feet thick. You go from a 50-foot vertical pay zone horizontally as much as 20,000 feet. Generally speaking, most of the wells are under 10,000. A lot of them are completed at around 5,000 feet. So instead of a 50-foot zone open, you have 5,000 feet of zone open. And that's a big multiplier. So if you got 50 feet of concrete and can break it up a little bit, that's one thing. If you got 5,000 and you can break it up, that means a whole lot more. And that's what's happening. They started doing horizontal drilling about 2000. A field up in North Dakota, they had been productive for years and years. They knew about it. They knew the zone was present. They just couldn't produce it. They didn't know how to get the oil out. So horizontal drilling was perfected by being able to put downhole equipment in such a situation that you could turn a vertical piece of pipe horizontally. That looks a little tough when the pipe's that big around, about a half-inch thick, but that's what they can do. They don't do the pipe turns with universal joints and so forth. I don't know a whole lot about that part of the world. Don't plan to learn. But I do know they can go from vertical to horizontal within 300 feet. And once you go horizontal now, you change the drilling system from a rotating bit from the surface to a hydraulic system. So you have a bit at the end of your drill pipe with a motor, a fluid motor. The motor turns with drilling fluid, turns the bit, and nothing else moves. The drill pipe back to the surface remains stable. And that's why you can do the horizontal. You couldn't rotate a well that went 90 degrees. The hydraulic system gets a little tricky because you're going into a zone that I told you could be 5,000 feet long or 10, whatever number you choose. You can take that zone, and if you don't have some way to direct it, it could be drilling out in Timbuktu and you wouldn't know it. That thing is down there 7,000 or 8,000 feet. So that they have perfected a system utilizing primarily the GPS directional system that we use all over the world. Your automobile uses it, your smartphone uses it. They can take a drilling well with a receiver in the drill assembly, and from the surface direct that bit within a 3 or 4 foot radius, up or down, in exactly the direction they want it to go. So they know exactly where the drill bit is at all times, and they know that they, understanding the formation, they know that they stay in the pay zone. And that's really important. Because again, we're dealing with very, very tight formations. And if you deviate from what you're trying, you won't get any oil at all. So that's a real important concept. Then you get this well drilled, you get down to what they call the kick point. They kick off, and before they drop the vertical well, they set a casing from surface down to this point. I'll use 7,000 feet as a number. You case that position and cement it by pumping cement down inside the pipe, outside the pipe, back up to the surface. So for all practical purposes, you have a 5,000 foot or 7,000 foot solid column that nothing can leak out or leak in. So you've heard lots of talk about groundwater, about fracking creating problems. Well, the best I have ever seen, and this is since 1950, there's never been a proven case that was won in a federal court that showed that fracking contaminated groundwater. That's 75 years of fracking. And that's all over the world. That's just not here. So that's a pretty good track record. The reason this happens because they're so careful about cementing and about the casing they run. They know that the groundwater is so important. And of course, you can't contaminate it because you can't use it. So that's what they do. They run the casing to get the kick point. They go to a new system. They create a horizontal well. They drill that 5,000-foot leg. And at that point, they run another set of casing through the horizontal borehole back up the surface again and cement that piece back up the surface. These are not simple things, and I can't explain them, but I know they do it. Once that's completed, then you're at the point where you want to produce some oil. You've done all the work to get there. So you have a casing that's solid. You have no way to get through it. So they have come up with a system, and it's not new, but it's been perfected, called perforating with hydrojets or with explosive jets. And these things are like a large bullet, steel encased bullet with an explosive device set to it. And they'll run that along the pipe. Inside the pipe, they'll be in a thing where they may have 100 different bullets ready to perforate. That perforates the pipe, the cement, and the formation. It might go as much as 10 or 15 feet into the formation, which is not very far. They have to obviously do better than that. But once that perforating part of it's done, they've got the hole in position that by fracking the well, they will be able to go into this formation that they're looking for oil. I mean, they know it's got oil, and create man-made fractures, if you will, by a method that I'll explain. They take in a general sense now a 500-foot section, 500 foot long. They perforate that zone. They put high pressure pumps on the surface, maybe 20 of them, simultaneously, all hooked together. They use between 10 and 15,000 barrels of water and up to 500,000 pounds of sand. And the sand is held in suspension in the water by a chemical process. That fluid is then pumped down the well inside another string of pipe that's called tubing, the completion tubing. It's about 3 inches thick, about that big. They pump this fluid away into those perforations, into the zone, and under these pressures, they create fractures in the formation, maybe up to 50 feet deep. And you do that, and you've got 360 degrees of pay surrounding your pipe because you're inside it. So your perforations can go any part of that pipe. Once you frack the well, and today they use what they call stage fracking, and a 5,000-foot zone may have as much as 20 zones fracked separately, but all in one session, maybe 4 days. And every session requires that kind of fluid and that kind of sand and that kind of pressure. That's all done from the surface. They have ponds that they build with liners. They have storage tanks. They do a lot of stuff on the surface to be able to make sure they have the adequate stuff. And once that fracture is completed, once they pump that fluid in under 10,000 pounds maybe, very high pressure, they release the fluid, they release the pressure, and the water, the fluid, comes back out of the formation, back into the borehole, because it's been high pressure, now no pressure. The sand drops when the pressure drops, the sand drops in the formation and creates a propping agent that props these minute fractures. Maybe they're open. I can't even give you a word, but it's microscopic. But when you're dealing with millions of them, it counts. The sand does the propping, the fluid does the penetrating. You remove both of those, you leave the sand, take the water out, and it's ready to go on production. And that's the system they use. It takes anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months. Costs anywhere from $7 to $10 million, and it could be as much as 2,000 barrels a day, or it could be as small as 500. But almost in all cases, especially today with the pricing it is, they are commercial. You are dealing with commercial reduction, and that's a big factor, of course. We went from under 6 million barrels of oil a day nationwide to over 12 million barrels a day in less than 20 years, all because of fracking. No new formations, no new discoveries, no Prudhoe bays, all fracking. Texas has got a big system down there. New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, there are Illinois, there's a number of states, 4 or 5 of them, California. They're all doing the same thing in the zones that they knew about. They knew it had oil. They just couldn't produce it. So that's the way they've done it, and that's the way it's going to be done. We will probably exceed 14 million barrels a day, unless the pandemic gets us again, in the next 2 years. Drilling has got in a little bind with the pandemic, and now trying to get back to normal has been difficult because of the shortage of rigs, the shortage of personnel, and government regulations. You've heard about that, of course. I'll give you one example about that. Wyoming is a state that is 65% owned by the federal government. 65%. So all the minerals in that 65% is owned by the federal government. And if you can't drill on the federal government's land, you can't find oil up there. They've done pretty well, and they're doing this horizontal stuff, but it's pretty difficult not to have adequate lands. So that's been a little bit of a hiccup, and you realize that oil is non-replaceable, and it does decline. They call it a declining curve from 1,000 barrels a day down here to 10, maybe 15 years down the road, something like that. So that's the story about fracking. You have 3 different sets of casing in the hole, all cemented. The ability of a fluid to move through that situation is almost really practically impossible. So the fact that the state of New York, which I can't understand, shut down fracking. And they were doing exceptionally well back there. They had a lot of wells. And for whatever political is the big step there, they shut down fracking, so New York is drilling no more wells. Pennsylvania is very strong. Ohio is doing quite well. West Virginia is doing wonderful. But if you don't have the cooperation of the feds, you got big problems. And in some of these bigger federal states like New Mexico, a lot of federal land out there, you can't drill on it. So we'll see how that develops. I'm not going to take any questions now because I want you to see the video. The video is complete day and night to what I've just talked about, and you'll find that out. So let's go and see how the fire works.
4 minutes after 5 o'clock on the afternoon of December 5th, 1973, a deep exploratory oil well in a remote section of Wyoming caught fire, painting the evening sky orange with a fiery
volume
flare
good?
300 feet high. The program you are about to see is the
Any
story
more
of the
volume
number
on
one
that?
Patterson, one of the largest onshore oil well fires in United States history. It's the best news I've heard about energy in a long time.
In deeper drilling, your risks are greater.
The company performed an outstanding cleanup operation.
Mr. Adair's company is cheap at any price. This is the Salt Creek oil field. It is located along the western edge of a sedimentary basin in eastern central Wyoming called the Powder River Basin. Oil was first discovered here in 1906. Salt Creek is one of this country's largest oil fields, having produced more than 500 million barrels of oil and over 50 billion cubic feet of natural gas. There are nearly 1,000 wells in this field, and most of them, still pumping, produce oil and gas from depths above 3,000 feet. Exploratory drilling in this country has been at a low ebb ever since 1955. Wildcatting, as we call it, is much different today than it used to be. There is still much oil and gas to be found in this country, but the shallow, easy-to-find fields, such as Salt Creek, have already been discovered. The remaining untapped reserves are much harder to find. The wildcatter must move into remote, untested areas and go deep as 30,000 feet in some of the sedimentary basins. These factors dramatically increase the cost and the risk. In August of 1973, Chaparral Resources and American Quasar Petroleum entered into a joint venture of exploration in the relatively deep, unexplored part of the Powder River Basin, approximately 25 miles east of the Salt Creek oil field. The sandstones which produce at the Salt Creek oil field at depths above 3,000 feet are found in this area between 12 and 14,000 feet. On August 26, 1973, drilling was commenced on our first well in this area, which we named the number one Patterson. By November 30, 1973, we were coring at a depth of 12,841 feet, just above the top of the Frontier Formation. Because the number one Patterson was a wildcat, we wanted to keep the well information on a temporarily confidential basis. Our only communication with the rig was by public radio telephone. For these reasons, we developed a code. If the well logged a gas show of, say, 100 units, Tommy Pop, our field engineer, would report 100 antelope on location. If 200 gas units were logged, he would say 200 antelope, and so forth. At 5 p.m., Tommy called in. He reported antelope on location. We asked, well, how many are there, 100? He said, a few more than that. We then asked, are there 500? He said, a few more than that. At that point, we knew we had a significant show, and we asked Tommy, were there 1,000 antelope on location? To that, Mr. Pop replied, would you believe the sons of bitches are running all over the rig? Call Red Adair. We've got a blowout. And we did have a blowout on our hands. The blowout preventers were activated, but the wellhead just couldn't hold the extreme pressure. A call was placed to the Red Adair Company in Houston. Jimmy Adair and his crew were on the Patterson location early the next morning. Their first plan was to hook onto the wellhead with high-pressure hoses and pump heavy mud down the hole to kill the flow. The first attempt failed. On December 5th, the crew began mixing more mud for a second attempt, this time with a heavier mixture of mud. The crew had shut down for dark. Crude oil covered the rig and was flowing into the reserve pits. There was no wind, and the natural gas lay heavy in the atmosphere. At 5 p.m., the number one Patterson well caught on fire. flames rose 300 feet into the air and could be seen from Casper Mountain, 65 miles away.
Is this a particularly dangerous fire here?
Yes, sir.
In what way?
It gets really big and hot. And when we get pulling that out, it's liable to blow out any direction.
The 400-ton steel drilling rig was reduced to rubble in less than 10 minutes. With the fire, a whole new set of circumstances had to be dealt with. A landing strip had to be built. Dozers and graders were brought in. High-pressure hoses were needed. Reserve pits were built for water. A cook shack and sleeping quarters for 50 men were constructed. One of the most necessary items needed in combating the fire was water. Construction was started on Patterson Lake, a 250,000-barrel capacity water reservoir near the well site. A pipeline had to be laid down to connect with another crude line to bring water into the location. 4 1,000-horsepower Halliburton pump trucks were used to pump water from a coal mine 14 miles away and from the North Platte River, which was 26 miles south of the well site.
Kind of risk it out what we can until we get that water this afternoon. We're supposed to get the water in our tank this afternoon. And we got to have that water in there to keep it from burning up. And it also protects you, makes the fire travel on.
Construction was started on all of the various kinds of equipment which had to be used. Heat shields had to be used on the water monitors and on the dozers. Booms and hooks had to be constructed and fitted onto the dozers and used to clear away the rubble which surrounded the wellhead. Getting together the supplies and equipment was a massive operation. The cost to contain and finally control the blowout and subsequent fire were commensurate with the equipment, manpower, and materials needed. In addition to the 12 million gallons of water needed to fill Patterson Lake and keep it full, 40,000 sacks of drilling mud were transported from Battle Mountain, Nevada, brought in by 30 rail cars and 20 trucks. 11 giant mud hoppers were moved to the well site to store the mud, and all the available mud mixers in the area were used. 11 oil field pump and cement trucks, and the 78 men needed to operate them came from as far away as Liberal, Kansas, Tioga, North Dakota, and Vernal, Utah. 14 pieces of earth-moving equipment, dozers, graders, and loaders, a helicopter as a standby ambulance, and a drilling rig were brought in from all parts of Wyoming. Specialized equipment to fight the fire, such as a dozer from West Texas, a 45-ton crane from Denver, Colorado, and nitrogel explosives, water pumps, water monitors, asbestos, and a 60-foot boom from Houston were gathered at the Patterson site. A 25-man, 24-hour security force was set for almost 3 weeks after the well blew out. By December 15th, Adair's crew had cleared much of the rubble and debris from around the well. Jimmy determined that if the Kelly was still intact, they might be able to hook onto the wellhead and pump mud down through the Kelly and kill the well without first extinguishing the fire. They hooked onto the Kelly and started pumping mud down, but the Kelly had so many fractures and leaks that it was impossible to get enough mud down the hole.
What's the single most biggest problem you've got with this fire?
Well, the way it's spread out. We need it going straight up and make it a whole lot easier to work.
One of the biggest problems which prevented Adair's men from getting in close to the fire was the fact that the remains of the Kelly were throwing flames in 2 or 3 different directions instead of straight up. Jimmy's next plan was to prepare a 150-pound charge of nitrogel, place it on the Kelly, and attempt to blow the Kelly off.
When you get handled to the explosives, that's when it's bad. Because you never know what's going to happen. Anything can happen at any time.
The first detonation failed to completely shear this Kelly bushing. After a delay caused by high winds, a second charge also failed to clear the wellhead. In hopes that the Kelly had been weakened by the 2 charges, An attempt was made to pull the Kelly free using a hook and boom attached to a dozer. This too failed. A third charge was prepared and detonated. It too failed to clear the wellhead. On December 22nd, a 500-pound charge of nitrogel was prepared. Water monitors were set in place to lower the temperature as much as possible. The charge, contained in a 55-gallon drum, was set in place with a boom and dozer. The charge was detonated and it succeeded in extinguishing the fire and clearing the debris. We now had the fire out, and the oil and gas was blowing straight up. We continued with some cleanup operations. On the 24th, we shut down for Christmas Eve. The winds were calm, and at 10:30, the well reignited. On the 26th, a second 500-pound charge snuffed out the fire once and for all. Our next step was to remove the damaged wellhead assembly and replace it with a new unit. The fire danger was still extremely high, and all of the striking tools were made of brass to prevent sparks. Engines were equipped with water scrubbers, and drums of water were attached to exhaust pipes. On January 2nd, 1975, the new wellhead assembly was in place. Mud was pumped down the hole, and the well was under control and shut in. With the well under control, a new drilling rig was brought in and placed over the hole, and drilling was continued to a total depth of 14,198 feet to fully evaluate the frontier formation and several potential zones below it. After the blowout, the crude oil covered several hundred acres around the well, ranging from a thin cover to ankle deep in some areas. It was cold enough that the crude oil was in a solid state. Using aerial surveys and soil studies, we constructed a series of dams to prevent any downstream contamination in case of an early runoff. Then, using graders, loaders, and dump trucks on a 16-hour-a-day basis, we graded the crude oil and snow into windrows, picked it up, and dumped it into a large reservoir built near the well. American Quasar Petroleum, as operator for the joint venture, has done an excellent job of restoring the location around the number 1 Patterson well. Working in cooperation with the federal and state environmental protection agencies, a land restoration program was engineered and implemented. The well site location and the several hundred surrounding acres were completely cleared of debris. All the reserve pits in the giant Patterson Lake have been covered over, and the hills and draws around the location have been recontoured and prepared for reseeding with special seed developed for surface coal mine revegetation. The campsite and all temporary equipment were replaced by permanent on-location facilities, and access roads were graded and gravelled. This is the number 1 Patterson well today. On July 11th, 1974, 7 months after the well was brought under control, we were pleased to announce the initial potential production of this well at 2,000 barrels of oil per day and 4.9 million cubic feet of gas. The story of the number 1 Patterson clearly points out the cost and the risk involved in this type of deep drilling. It also points out the potential. In the last 2.5 years, in a 1,200 square mile area along the deep part of the Powder River Basin axis, the success ratio has been impressive. 1 out of 3 exploratory wells drilled has been a discovery. Overall, with over 40 wells drilled, 1 out of every 2 wells has been a producer. Our country needs to become self-sufficient in energy. Given the proper motivation, it is our belief that in areas such as this can be accomplished. Wells are producing, and new, deeper exploratory wells are being drilled. The challenge, the risk, and the rewards are here in this country. It is truly a great legacy.
Gentlemen, that's a terrifying and at the same time a gratifying piece of film. It's terrifying because of the enormous hazard this seems to project. Mr. Hoovler, did any lives get lost at number 1 Patterson?
Dr. Mitchell, we were very fortunate at that well. We had a blowout and a fire for 33 days, and we did not have 1 injury or 1 loss of life.
That's astonishing. Mr. Adair, how about problems presented by a well fire like that?
Dr. Mitchell, they present quite a few problems. Your main problem would be your location of your wellhead being in the cellar, and needing equipment. You need water, which is 20 miles away. It presents quite a problem.
How many men do you bring to fight a fire like that?
On this Patterson well, there were 2 men. It was my son Jimmy and Richard Hatterberg.
So your lives are dependent upon the kind of protection Mr. Hoovler and the #1 Patterson crew provide, aren't they?
Yes, sir, they are, and from what I gather, they did everything possible to protect each one.
Well, it's a tremendous safety feat considering the nature of what was going on. Mr. Jones, what about the terrain? I looked at that film as you did. It looks like the surface of the moon when the fire ended. Is there any hope for that terrain really on a short or a long-term basis, and how are you involved in that hope?
Well, amazingly, in this particular situation, we found little significant environmental surface damage. We are monitoring the situation. I think primarily we had little damage was due to the fact we had no surface water in the immediate area.
Yet you have holes dug, and there must be melted metal and all sorts of debris. Are you saying that it's possible now with what we know and what we are learning to take care of that on a short-term basis so we don't have that surface of the moon effect, and that in the end that piece of land will not be identifiable as a place where a terrible fire took place?
Oh, yes. The companies have techniques and the materials available to do a very adequate and outstanding cleanup job, and also restoration work with the help of various state and other federal agencies and the academic community coming up with solutions to problems like this all the time.
What kind of federal agencies would be involved in restoring that piece of terrain?
Well, the Department of Interior agencies.
What do they do, for example?
The Department of Agriculture is also involved. They perform studies on the particular area that are going on all the time. They know their area, they know what the needs of it are, and they know the proper procedures to go through to make any restoration.
Mr. Adair, you tore up a lot of turf around there, and I gather explosives are a very important part of fighting a fire like this.
Yes, sir, they are, and you use the explosive to tear away your debris, also extinguish your fire.
Can I ask you what a Kelly is while we're talking about debris? That seemed to be the most difficult piece to get off that wellhead, wasn't it?
Yes, sir, it is. Kelly is square, and it's used to rotate your pipe. And there could be a lot of stories about your Kelly, but it's a tough piece of material. It won't break like your drill.
Well, why do you have to get the debris off? Is it because it's so hot that it starts the fire again by itself?
You have to clear your wellhead to get all of your flow going in the air so that you can get in there and work and take all of the burnt equipment off and put new equipment on it.
The dynamite is then primarily to clear the equipment away?
It does 2 purposes. It clears away your debris, and it also puts out your fire. And one other thing we're talking about, on all of the blowouts I've been on, which I've been on quite a few, after we leave the location, like getting your location clean, you can never tell a couple of years later if you've ever had a blowout.
That's remarkable. By the way, you must be a pretty expensive fellow to have around when you have a fire. How about that, Mr. Hoovler? Is he come cheap, or what does the #1 Patterson represent in terms of expense?
I'll point this out to you, Dr. Mitchell, that Mr. Adair's company is cheap at any price.
I suppose Mr. Jones is even cheaper because you never have to pay a federal official, except under very different circumstances. What about the cost of an episode like this? This must be a catastrophically expensive thing.
Yes, it was a very expensive well, and I might point out that in this area, generally, and of course on deeper drilling, the wells are extremely expensive in a relative thing to 4 or 5 years ago. The normal well through this area costs something in excess of $1 million.
What you're saying is that the first few thousand feet aren't all that expensive to drill compared to the next few thousand feet in the same hole.
That's exactly right. And as Mr. Adair pointed out, deeper drilling requires much larger equipment, much more sophisticated equipment, much different type of high-pressure equipment.
So you're actually what you're doing is you're increasing your risk.
You increase the risk, and of course you increase, in a relative sense, you increase the cost tremendously.
And you increase the hazard of fire, Mr. Adair, too, or some other episode?
Well, I don't know. He's saying increase it. You're training your men more. You have blowout programs. You have simulators to train your men with for these deeper wells, which will give you a gas kick at, say, 17,000 feet.
But you got a worse fire at 17,000 feet or at 15,000 feet than you do at 5,000 feet.
Oh, yes, sir, you do.
And what's the reason for that? Just the increased pressure?
Well, your increased pressure, your depth, the weight on all of your pipe, and staying on the well so long that you can wear a hole in the pipe. It's a many problem.
You're fighting a fire that started 3 miles down, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
And that must be a staggering thing. Mr. Jones, as you look at the future, what you're going to see, obviously, in this area, and I know you coordinate the federal efforts in this area, you're going to see more deep wells being drilled. And I suppose that, from your point of view, means that more opportunities to deal with episodes of this kind, or spills, or other byproducts. Do the federal agencies feel that this is a especially difficult problem, or are you prepared for it?
I think essentially the federal agencies and state agencies are, with the experience we've gained over the past 5 or 6 years in the cleanup of oil spills. I see no particular problems that we haven't already faced in the past.
So when you drive past a well being drilled, or one that's operating, you don't think of it as a hazardous device. You think of the hazard as being the exception rather than the rule.
True.
And you think that when an episode takes place, you know how to handle it.
The various people involved do an outstanding job, such as technicians like Mr. Adair and other people in the country that have their specialties that we can call on for assistance.
Do you have special people who just stand by and watch wells being drilled, or do you just come to them when you feel you're needed?
We only respond when there's a need. If a blowout does occur or a spill comes from the facility, then we respond to that facility.
But you have a long-term program to deal with these kinds of things.
Right.
As energy needs are met in the future by different kinds of drilling and different kinds of activity, there is a federal long-range program.
Right. Various federal agencies have control of the drilling operation. Ours is primarily concerned with the environment, and we work under the federal environmental pollution laws.
Well, Mr. Hoovler, what about you? If you have all those federal agencies, you've got a lot of paperwork, and you must have an enormous amount of expense just meeting requirements and dealing with responsibilities that never were characteristic of earlier days.
That's correct. And as Mr. Jones has pointed out and has been discussed here, we have not only the environmental people to be involved in these new wells, these deeper drilling wells, but we have the USGS, which is a branch of the Bureau of Land Management, works with the Bureau of Land Management. We have to satisfy their requirements. We have to make sure that the environmental standards are met both before, during, and after a well. There's many cases where where things have come up now that a few years ago we didn't even know existed.
When you get ready to drill a well, then, it isn't just geological investigation that you have to deal with and that affects your decision. It's all sorts of other things that deal with the regulations on how wells are drilled.
That's correct. That's very correct.
I should think that takes time and costs a lot of money.
Well, I think particularly in the deeper drilling, again, time is money, and we do get involved. Many times we may have to do certain things around a well site. That
you never did tell me, by the way, how much that number 1 Patterson fire cost.
The number 1 Patterson well cost in excess of $4 million.
Over and above the normal cost of drilling the well.
That's I don't have all the final figures.
So when you try to drill a deep well, what you have is a normal risk that must be substantial. Just the cost of getting down 3 miles.
That's
deep,
right.
And
I think you might recognize they're not all wells.
That's right.
There are a few dry holes drilled.
I was going to say, the risk that's built into this process is that when you get down 3 miles, you might just find a cold draft down there and nothing else.
We call it the suitcase sand.
Yes, well, all of us. Of course, if there is anything that represents the risk involved in the free enterprise system, I guess drilling a well is it, because you drill it at your own expense and you have a good cry at your own expense. And often people don't notice that. They just see you with oil coming out the top and think you're in an easy business. Mr. Adair, you know it isn't an easy business because sometimes it doesn't work. What's being done on a long-term basis to keep these episodes like the fire at number 1 Patterson from
Well, we have an organization called the Clean Gulf on the Gulf of Mexico. And like you were talking about cost to Mr. Hoovler, I can tell you one job we did not too long ago. It cost $51 million. That's on cleanup, and this is how we learn.
Offshore or onshore?
Offshore.
Offshore. Well, I meant to ask you about that. Doesn't the water put out the fire?
No, it's all burning above the water, and if people could just see the equipment we have now. We have new skimmers, we have new devices to pick up oil. We just found a new one the other day that's fantastic.
Just to take care of an oil spill on the surface of the water, then?
Yes, sir. We work with the USGS, the Coast Guard, Parks and Wildlife, the Railroad Commission. We have to stay hand in hand.
So you have your own regulatory problems, too, and what you could do when an episode takes place is terribly important in terms of its cost to you and the constraints on how you're able to function.
Yes, we do, and it's the main reason we use anything is for lives. When you're in there working in a real dangerous area, you need different stuff to work with.
Have you and Mr. Hoovler ever worked together before on an episode?
No, sir, my son had the privilege of working with him.
Well, I guess it's a privilege depending upon the circumstances. How often does this happen? We see this roaring fire on this film. Is this an everyday occurrence or a rare occurrence?
It's happens about 35 times a year to us.
How many oil rigs are running in the United States right now as we sit here?
As we look at it, I think we were talking the other day, there's been over 3,500 wells completed in the United States, and how many rigs run that stuff in that same
So
vicinity?
when you're talking about 3,500 rigs and 35 episodes of fire of various degrees of intensity, that's a very tiny fraction, isn't it?
That's a small fraction of what really
I
happens.
suppose when you're dealing with one like number one Patterson, it looks pretty big when you're there. But it's good to have a perspective on that, isn't it?
Yes, sir, it is, and it's awful small.
Mr. Jones, what's your feeling about the long-term problems you're going to be facing? Are there special kinds of problems you haven't dealt with before? Are you being innovative at the federal agencies?
We're constantly looking at the problems. We have internal research going on all the time to improve materials and techniques for recovery and cleanup and restoration. Land farming experiments going on for disposal. We also have contracts with various universities going on.
The days when all of this used to be a big mystery and you stood around the well wondering what would happen are now over. There is a profession of anticipation in a way. It's a profession of dealing with risks. Mr. Hoovler, is it worth it? Is deep drilling worth it?
Dr. Mitchell, the risk of deep drilling is manifold, and there's without question, when you analyze what this country needs, the risks must be taken. We don't really have any choice, because we must become, to a degree, energy self-sufficient. And the easy, shallow oil, as we've discussed, is simply gone from the United States.
So if we're going to be energy self-sufficient, what you're saying is we're going to have to drill deeper. What Mr. Adair says is if we drill deeper and the hazards are greater, he's got long-term programs that are going to help us deal with that. But Mr. Jones is saying that when episodes occur, these are no longer mysterious, unhandleable things, but there are long and short-term programs to deal with that. I would say, gentlemen, that listening to you, I am hearing the best news about our energy prospects I've heard in a long time.
That's it. I'd answer a question if I can. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much for your presentation and your excellent helping us understand fracking, at least me. Anyway, I wanted to know about the water that's involved. That's always been one of my concerns. How much water consumption is involved in fracking? Because they keep saying they're coming a day when water is going to be more precious than oil.
That's God's answer.
Well, good.
I don't have any answer. But we use, as I pointed out, 15,000 barrels per frac. About half of that is recoverable, and they can use it again. But over a 20 frac job, like we use on those 5,000-foot wells, it takes how much? 20 times 15. A lot of water, a lot of water. But apparently, well, you knew, up in the DJ Basin, we don't have a problem with water, even though Colorado is about as dry as it is here.
Yes, I do. I grew up in upstate New York, and
Why don't you get the mic, Wick?
close.
Maggie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I grew up in upstate New York, and
She has to put it closer.
Blue mic a little more.
there, have I got it now? All
That's
right,
better.
I'm sorry, Paul. Actually, I grew up in upstate New York in the something region that's called the Marcellus something or other. Anyway, they are supposedly good for fracking, and people up there are fighting it. You know, the colleges and everything. They just against it. They don't want to see the area lose its bucolic beauty and all, which it won't. I wish that everyone could see that film in upstate New York so that they'd vote properly. You know, that was great.
Well,
Thank you.
I told you New York has shut down fracking, and there's no reason.
Yeah.
No reason for it at all. There's been, I forget the number, but I think it's a lot of wells in the last 20 years they've drilled on this horizontal concept. And they've had practically nothing in the way of contamination. And once you drill a well, you can see on that film, once you drill it, even in that mess we had, you clean it up, you can't tell anything happened. You have a drill site, and that's it. Anything else? You're all experts now. Thank you very much.